Welcome to Out of the Woods, the threat hunting podcast.
Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to our Out of the Woods Threat Hunting live Discord interactive podcast again, where we aim to cover the burning topics relating to all the threat hunting and security stuff you want to know about. So just a reminder, throughout the podcast, we'll be taking comments and questions from our Discord server. So if you want to participate, interact with some of the topics and things we have going on, make sure you sign up using the link in the welcome message. And quick introductions, I'm Scott Poley. If you want to learn more about me and kind of my history, LinkedIn's a great place for that. And we also have Mike Lee. You guys can introduce yourselves.
Lee, go ahead.
No, same thing. Lee Archinal. I've been here for about 3 years, threat hunting, having fun. Find more on my LinkedIn.
Yep. And I'm Mike. Same thing. Find me on LinkedIn. Just glad to be surrounded by a great team of hunters. And yeah, let's get into it.
So just as everyone, if they don't know yet, every episode we do feature a cocktail recipe made by our team. So give it a try and leave feedback in the channel if you like it. It's the crypto cooler this time. I actually thoroughly enjoy it so far, so hopefully it's a good one all the way through. But let's just dive right in. We usually start with 3 interesting artifacts that each of us find that we want to talk about to kind of start off the discussion before discussing other types of topics based on our experience. So with that, Mike, I think you got the first topic.
All righty. Yeah, so everybody's been talking about, ChatGPT. There's actually, it's starting to hit the, pop culture. I think South Park did an amazing episode about it last week. So it's everywhere, right? And so I kind of want to talk about some of the potential security risks about implementation, right? About as you start to use it in your day-to-day. We're already seeing, kids, students, researchers use it to build copy, to build documentation. But we're now starting to see an inflection point where corporations are starting to bake it into their everyday process. And so there was a really interesting article. I posted an article from Metro, but it's basically warning security threats from ChatGPT and chatbots. So at a high level, basically, when you submit something or use those models or use the API or use the kind of the chat interface, and I'll talk to it specifically on ChatGPT, that data is going somewhere, right? You have to basically input that data for that model to be able to return the values that you're expecting to return, kind of inference, or if it asks it to summarize something and you give it some corporate documents, that data is going somewhere, right? And so as we started to research it, we looked into how the data was used. There are some interesting ways that you can opt out, and depending on how you interact with ChatGPT, you could potentially opt out of that data, being pulled back into that model and that inference model. And so, Scott, Lee, have you used it yet? Just kind of curious at a high level on usage, and then talking about how it could be a potential problem over time.
Yeah, I'll hop in here. So, I think this kind of stems from anything you use on the internet, as far as like if you're going to provide data, it's kind of just available. So, I'm the kind of person that expects to have kind of data loss, amongst that. Like, I've even seen where engineers will share probably more information they should on blogs to help them solve problems with engineering things, or, things like that. And so you can kind of crawl things like those types of forums to see the same thing. And the only thing with ChatGPT and other chatbot type stuff, you can't really control where that is. You can't really remove what you've submitted. But in this case, you kind of can if you have a paid account. So one of the things that one of the guys on the team shared is if you have a paid account, you can actually opt out of all the conversation data you typically share. Won't go into the training model, and I think that's a great way for those chatbots to kind of maintain some of that. Obviously, if you're using the free, you can't control any of it, which I think that's kind of like the price for playing. So I think that's still kind of fair. But it's good to be aware of. I don't know if I'll share the link for the opt-out form if anyone's interested, but that's kind of like how I look at that. Like it is a risk. Like I remember I was reading about, it might have been a CEO, but he was trying to build a PowerPoint off of financial data.
Yep.
And so he wanted ChatGPT to help him build it. So he threw all this data into ChatGPT, and I'm sure it laid it out how you'd want to put it in a PowerPoint, but that data's gone. Now, something that's really good about data is the older it is, usually it loses value over time, typically.
Good point.
So you kind of have that in your favor sometimes, but if the data is still going to hold value over longer than a month or 2 months, it becomes higher risk, right?
Yep.
So something to kind of consider when it comes to that.
Yep. Lee, have you played around with
the
it?
link?
So I've honestly messed with it like from a completely different angle. So I did have to write a research paper, and I'm not saying I used ChatGPT. I was like, ironically, the paper was to write or to justify upcoming or emerging technology and why a company should adopt it. And I was like, we've been talking about ChatGPT for weeks. I was like, that's gonna be an easy paper to write. So I did. And the example I used was creating a query from Splunk, right? Like I compared it to how much you have to learn from the documentation, trial and error, going through and trying to figure out your way out. Whereas if you could ask ChatGPT and say, hey, give me this, it spits out real quick. Personal side, it was actually fun. Me and the kids played Dungeons and Dragons using ChatGPT. So like we were like, yeah, we were just like, tell us the story, and we went through. So no sensitive data, no like anything like that I can apply to.
That's
but
fun.
yeah, I mean that's what and that's honestly like how I see it. It's not. I try to be careful about what I put in there, especially because of the whole thing. But yeah, that's what I've done with it.
Yeah, so
I feel like you created a very unique use of. I was gonna say like Dungeons and Dragons with ChatGPT. Like
that's awesome.
You just created probably a whole new product just for that statement alone. But go ahead.
Yeah.
It was funny though. It was great.
That's an awesome use of it. Yeah. So what's interesting is I'm starting to see ChatGPTs pop up in random products. Like there's been a tool that's popped up and it's like, hey, use ChatGPT for XYZ. And it's interesting because in that tool, for the people that are using it, you could exfil a lot of very important data, right? And of course, even if it's anonymized, you can still infer a lot about that data if you put a couple of points together, right? Data points together, you kind of infer where it's coming from or what it's talking about. So it'd be very interesting to see, and I would love to understand how they're protecting those models and that data, right? Imagine a leak of ChatGPT's models with all those random organizations and entities shipping data to it. It's a fire hose of probably very useful data, right? So I hope they're at least protecting it from a security standpoint. And one day we don't see some sort of exposure of that data model. And then Microsoft just announced their Copilot program. That's basically a kind of machine learning AI kind of built-in capability that allows you to prompt it with documents and say, I need a summary of this document or this Word document, and then this maybe OneNote, and it will build a document for you. But that data, again, is going somewhere, right? And it's probably a good segue into potentially that Microsoft vulnerability that we've been tracking. But it's, it's just about securing that data, especially as you start shipping things to the cloud and understanding where that data is going and how it could potentially be harmful for you and your organization.
And honestly, if you look back at, what was it, Cambridge Analytica?
Yep.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Facebook stuff. Like they were collecting just like personal information, and look what they did with it. Like look what they were able to do with that level of detail or information. This, if people are putting sensitive data in and just throwing numbers and possibly IP in there, and God, like you can only imagine, right?
Yeah, especially if you're able to tag the data coming in, saying this is financial data, and just redirect that into some sort of other bucket of all the other financial data that you're collecting.
Yeah.
This is personal identifying information, or this is, it's scary, right? And we don't know how they're using the data today, and it could end up being another Cambridge Analytica where they might sell that off to somebody, right? And that could be used in a variety of different ways. It's just kind of the Wild West right now. So it's going to be fun to track this over time.
Knowing that already, I mean, what percentage do you think they're already doing it? Like, who do you think's already trying to find the data sets? Who's like, how do you feel about like 50-50, 75-25 that they are? Do you think they're overlooking it right now?
I feel like the one thing that the data is not structured enough for someone to extract it without having something interpret it well enough. I think that's where it sits. So I feel comfortable with that. It'd be like a big cloud of confusion, but it's still a data set and just takes time with any amounts of data. I mean, like that's why there's organizations in the world that collect tons of data with not knowing what to do with it, just so they can have it when they figure out what to do with it. So, it comes down to like a data thing.
I mean, it's a proven financial model. I mean, it's been proven time over time with the Facebooks, the Googles of the world. Data is kind of key to their monetary success.
It's kind of like a new currency.
Right? It is. It absolutely is.
Like, what was it? Insurance companies make more money off your data than they do actually you paying for insurance. I mean, like that says something, right? Like that's so when people think about their privacy and the amount of data, like data is actually worth more than the dollar value.
Mm-hmm. No, 100%. Yeah, it's.
If you're not paying for the product, it's because you are the product.
Yeah,
I like that. That's good. Yeah, so again, it'll be fun to track this over time. I think one of the big things I think we're going to see, and we talked about it a little bit before, is the potential legality of what ChatGPT is returning, because it is scraping the internet. And so you're going to see a lot of cease and desists. And that's what I worry about, people putting it, just baking it into their platforms, because if that happens, ripping out something that you spent design dollars on and budget on to build into a product, and having to rip that out because of legality issues, it could be very problematic in the future, right? So if you're already,
I don't even know how you rip that out of something like that.
I mean,
so that'd be a challenge for them.
Yeah, it's basically removing a feature, right, that you're kind of leveraging. So Microsoft Copilot, right? I mean, their data sets are against ChatGPT's models, and the data that it's collected to be able to infer and return those values. Now, if people put a kind of cease and desist on that data being available, where does it go from there, right? Have they collected enough data to make it successful ahead of that like legal action, or is that something that's just going to kind of fade away and they'll have to retool and figure out how to move forward? So it's going to be fun to watch. Or you can just use it to respond to your wife or girlfriend, like South Park did. No spoilers, but it was a great episode.
They do a good job.
Yeah.
So Lee, I don't know if you want to jump over to yours.
Yeah, so I'm probably gonna pronounce this wrong, but I think it's Bean Lion or Bian Lion. I don't know. The ransomware, BIANLIAN. That group, they have so back in the day when they were conducting some campaigns, Avast, the decode team, I believe it's the decode team, or sorry, the decrypted team. No, yeah, decoded avast.io. They created a decryptor for it. So they're like, hey, we're good. Like if you got hit with it, don't pay, or if you get hit with it, come to us. Well, these guys, they're like, well, you know what? Forget that. We're going to just straight up extort you. So they've moved away from ransomware because, in the ransomware world, if you're given the decryption key, and it's not working, you're not making money, then that spreads, right? You're going to say, oh, just don't pay because they're not going to decrypt it anyways. So if your product's not working, they just went full out, and instead of doing the double extortion where they ransomware you and then say, oh, well, we have your data anyways too, pay more. They're just going straight to extortion, which I thought was interesting. I know the IBM vector, or the paper that came out a while ago, I was reading up on that to see what it said on about ransomware. And it was talking about different variants, and I don't think it didn't touch on a lot of money making. But it was just curious to see how the ransomware came out, how an organization said, you know what, we found a decryption key, or we figured it out, and they just moved. They were like, all right, whatever, like, you may have got us. We're not going to put that much time and money into creating a new encryptor, because if that's the case, and another organization finds it, they provide that for free again, then we're out of money. So what's the best way forward for us to do it? And that's just extortion, which I thought was interesting. But what were your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's interesting because you kind of brought up the most obvious point that I wasn't thinking, but when they said they were relying more on extortion, I was thinking, oh, people are getting better at backing up their data, so the encryption thing isn't working as well anymore. So you fall back on what are other ways to make money. Obviously, it makes sense. If there is a decryptor, then obviously you're not going to rely on the encryption either. So that's probably the obvious answer. I was giving people more credit than they probably do, maybe. But something I always think is interesting when people come up with decryptors, and I'm assuming I'm right on this. I've seen some proof of this, but I haven't really dug into every security firm that comes up with a decryptor. But usually they solve the problem either because they're not really doing a good job randomizing keys, or they figured out how they generate those keys so they can replicate that process. Like they take some unique thing from the type of endpoint or something like that to help seed the key. It's usually not like a break of the encryption if they're using standard vetted encryption. And that's something I think people need to understand too when it comes to encryption. Most of the time, even as attackers beat encryption, is never a direct attack, right? It's like hey, we figured out how to side channel this, or we figured out how to get in front of this in some way. So it's kind of like it's more of the process, I guess I should say, for how they attack those things. But I did look at their initial write-up when they talked about like their behaviors and stuff like that, and they did some like sample, they call them LOL commands, which kind of made me laugh because of the lol bins, but they're LOL. So they did some of the net exe type enumeration stuff, which we commonly see amongst all ransomware groups. I like to call that out because I feel like all ransomware groups kind of wear the same skill sets. I know like their end result may be slightly different, but I feel like the way they live is the same. But the one thing I did see, and I don't know if you've seen this, Lee, and I'm only picking on you because you did a lot of UAC type stuff, but they did interact with the registry key for the allow to get help, which just sounds like the perfect UAC bypass type technique. So that was listed in their report as well, where that it looks like they maybe have like enabled that. They didn't really put anything unique in that key. So it was kind of like so that allowed to get help, usually those like convenient type functions in a system you can leverage for things. It looks like that's what they did. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of interesting, and you see kind of a similar approach as other ransomware groups typically use. And I think, I harp on this, but like I said, I think they all kind of behave the same. And I think if we learn that, we'll be better at defending against that. So it's good to check out their initial report. I guess I'm leading to that. I'll share the link.
I mean, there is a reason that the time frame is now less than 4 days versus what it used to be 2 months. I mean, they all learned those techniques. And they figure out, and I'm sure they talk. Just because they're criminals doesn't mean they don't talk to each other, but if they can say, hey, look, this is what we're doing. We've been able to ransom in 3 days versus 2 months, then I mean, why not? Because it's really smash and grab, right?
What do you
I think it's
attribute to that delta and that change in time outside of not doing the full encryption, or a lot of times you have those advanced persistent threats that really want to sit and wait, get their foothold, and then try to go after these organizations. So is it just because people are paying, so why wait at this point? Or what do you attribute to that delta?
Their business model is very specific, and they're not like, I would say the more advanced persistent threat wants to be able to sit there, even if they do specific actions on objective, they want to maintain that access.
Mm-hmm.
And ransomware groups, I feel like once they've gotten the data and been able to launch their encryption campaign across the network as best they can, they've kind of announced themselves, so they don't expect to persist. If they do, I'm sure they'll do more conniving things, but I think that just shortens the dwell time. They figured out, like, it's almost like an SOP for, we get in, we just need to work really hard to get to this point, which in most cases maybe DA, but maybe not. Maybe they can just get to something that gives them enough administrative privileges to just start detonating things across to create enough havoc. And that's kind of their thing. And so it shortens that time window a lot, because it's easy to achieve that, which is kind of scary, because you think about, if the ransomware groups can get that level of access in that short period of time, that means an advanced attacker, unless they want to move slow, can probably get that access just as fast. They just don't do anything with it. Right. So, but I was going to say, one of the reasons why I think they share a lot of the same TTPs is because it's like that kind of ruffian type of hacker group, where I feel like they're there to make money, and if they don't like the people they work with, or they have a fallout, they just ban frequently, or they get shut down maybe, right? And then they just kind of get absorbed into these other groups. So I feel like it's a lot of the same people, and it kind of carries those fingerprints with them as far as behaviors. And then they're like, oh, well, I do this works really well, and I've already wrote how to do this, so use this. So you have these inexperienced people picking up on the same techniques as the experienced people. And there's a lot of information being shared that way, I feel like. So.
And to your point, and I think Lee, you made this as well, is like, you're not seeing novel techniques and tactics in ways these guys are getting in. This is kind of like the tried and true, easy button almost for these guys to jump in and manipulate the situation. So the other thing is that shortened time frame. What I initially think is that that's probably a less mature organization that they're infecting or trying to ransom. I don't know if the article talked about the size of the org or the complexity and maturity of that organization based on that time frame, but you see a note on a machine that says you've been ransomed, pay within 4 days. We have your data. I would assume that a less mature organization, unless they understand how to look for the visibility, they're not engaging in a IR team because they don't have the time. Do they know how to go and look for, oh, we've had data exfil over the past 6 days, they've touched all of these files and exfilled all of these files. Typically there's not a, they call it proof of life, where you talk to the hostage, or here's some of your data that we've exfilled. Are they just kind of taking them on their word and saying, oh crap, let's pay? They don't have the time to go do those IR processes to even check if they actually have the data. They might just have access to a particular machine, drop that ransom note, and
yeah, and sometimes I've seen too where these adversaries will share something, and sometimes it might not be like as telling. So we were even just talking about like the ring thing with ransomware, right?
Yeah.
Where like they were like, we got ring, and then it came out, like you were mentioning earlier, that it might have been like a contractor that had some ring type stuff. So they post some things, and like if people have the time to be like, oh, well, there's no evidence of you on our network, and the stuff you have, we know that we don't control, and it's shared elsewhere, and other people could have it. That's something too. I wonder like how organizations, because the time's ticking, right? And that's not easy unless you have like the perfect tools in place and the right processes in place. It's not easy to tell what everyone's touched necessarily. So yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, they don't have that like particular set of skills to go out and find that person or find the bad, right? They don't have a Liam Neeson to go track it down.
Yeah.
So looking at the report, the IBM report says in 2022, X-Force also observed more aggressive ransomware attacks on underlying infrastructure, such as ESXi and Hyper-V. The potentially high
Yeah.
impact of these attacks methods underscores importance of securing domain controllers and hypervisors properly. So if they were targeting those more than the standard operation, then I mean, that would reduce the amount of time they would need to spend there, correct?
If
Is
you're
that the answer?
attacking, if you're attacking like a Horizon, which is a VDI solution, or ESXi, I mean, you have the keys to the kingdom if you get root access to those. Like you can just turn
For a
things
large
off,
portion of
delete
the network.
things.
Yeah.
You might not need to even exfil the data. I mean, there's ways that you could stop the access by, changing some networking, some firewalling, some account, credentials, kind of looking through to see if they've created additional accounts to kind of sideload and get access. But again, there's a complexity and a methodology and maturity around being able to actually go find those things, right? If you're a two-man IT shop, but you're a decent small to medium, organization, and you see that note, you're probably going to pay, right? And it's smart to say you have 4 days, because to engage an IR team, to get the contract, to get people access and on site, and to work through that takes longer than 4 days if you don't have it in-house.
So something to note about the ESXi stuff. I've developed some things for those, but as I've looked at all the different approaches to these different groups that have targeted ESXi, they all kind of fall back on the same tried and true first way it happened, and then they kind of like tweak that a little bit, but they have some of the core ways in which they shut down services, in which they execute certain commands. So like I said, it's kind of funny how maybe there's only a certain ways for you to do this with the type of access you'd have, so the attackers follow the same path, or they're just doing the same thing. They find the samples that we seem to find, do the same thing, learn from them, and then basically do the same techniques. But there is very commonly shared techniques attacking the ESXi infrastructure for sure.
Yeah.
So
I'd be curious to see, and I should probably just show Dan how many people expose their ESXi to the internet, which would be a kind of a weird move, I guess, unless you need that.
Yeah, Log4Shell showed some of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's always scary jumping into Shodan and punching in a port or a service and seeing how many servers are actually on the internet that don't need to be. It's always that's a candy land for these guys, right? That'd be the first step, right? Let's go see what's on the internet. Let's check it out, and then you can map that to the vulnerability of the exploit. And we always talk about kind of eating our own dog food, but as an organization, I would jump online, throw the port, throw the service, and see if my IP address space pops up, right? Run those type of external scans on yourself. And that'd be the first step to potentially stop that kind of exploitation, right?
I think you bring up a really good point, and I feel like when I've worked in security, a lot of people kind of shy away from this. But like no one wants to create detections or hunt for, hey, we were reconned, right? Like, oh, look, people are hitting us from the internet. Like it's like kind of a waste of time, so to speak. But what really is a good approach is, why don't you use the same recon tools that people are using against yourself and see what you find, so you at least know what's exposed. I think that's the better approach that you get way more value from, right? Not relying on trying to see, oh, well, someone just scanned us with a tool. Look at the user agents on this. They just scanned our server with that. It's like, cool. Well, the server is publicly exposed, so you should expect that.
Yep.
And then so that's I kind of think the better approach for it.
Yeah, and typically those tools are not complex. They're pretty easy to run and deploy and understand the results that come back. So that would be the first thing I would do from a cadence perspective, is have those reports on a daily basis, right? Talking about good standard practices or good SOP around kind of security and those day-to-day things, that should be a top priority, and then you work your way down, right? It's almost, again, kind of lined up with the MITRE techniques and tactics, recon, and you go into initial access and you kind of work down the line. And we always get asked the question, where should we start from a threat hunting perspective? And while we typically don't try to hunt for reconnaissance, because it's, again, a pretty easy methodology to deploy, but it's really just kind of stepping through that process of hunting kind of tied to those tactics, gets you kind of a really good place to start.
Yeah, the answer
So
to that is always like, well, you know, what scares you the most? What are you most worried about? You know, that's where you should start hunting. Is it exfil? Is it, you know, persistence? Whatever the case may be. But especially with the Shodan stuff, if you're in a conversation, someone says, well, that port should never be exposed to the internet. That's normally a good place to start.
yeah, so
Right.
something else that I thought was hugely valuable, and that I can't remember the specific lab site that had like a better way to report this, but have you guys ever heard of DNS Twister?
It sounds familiar.
So, all right. So DNS Twister is basically where you can take the domains that you own, you could put it in there, and it will give you every single like typo squatted way you can do that domain. So how people can fake your domain through many different techniques, right? Like either like shifting it by one letter, using letters that are similar or whatever. So it'll give you a huge list of everything that someone can use from like a phishing perspective. But I think the newer version also tells you if any of those are registered. So now you can even say, hey, we've got all these domains that someone can potentially use, which you can just almost straight put in a block list because most of them either don't exist, and if they're registered, they're probably either parked or going to be planned to use maliciously. But it was a great approach to like kind of like that proactive recon, like, hey, what is out there that is closely resembles us that someone can use against us, kind of thing. And there's another site I'd have to dig in to try and find it, but it actually did the full report of those types of things as well. But it's a really, really strong tool, and I think it's a great place to start for some of those things.
I mean, if you're at google.com, right, like buy all of those domains. If you really care about security, like buy all of them. You have the money, right? Like it's a really good place to, I don't know.
So while you're
I
talking
just
about
block it.
Right.
the tool I put right under what you were talking about, Poley, that's actually something I found whenever I first, actually when we first started at First Energy, me and another analyst were sitting up night watching Black Hat videos, right? I think it was like Black Hat 19 or they came up with Enamall, the Python script that you put in your domain. I think it was domain or IP address, and it would go through the internet and find all the different servers, like use it FTP, you know, like anything that was not top level, like, but anything associated with your organization. There's any modifications, it would find it and just listed it out there. So that's a way that you could take a look at, you know, what do we already have that's possibly vulnerable. It was actually a really interesting find.
Yeah, that just kind of goes
So-
into the sanitation of orgs, right? So you might have a marketing team spins up a info at or info dot or kb dot, or you know, starting to build subdomains against your main domain that you might not know are out there, right? So it just kind of goes into that sanitation of kind of your org. Go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know how to pronounce the name because it's all underscores, but Jay from Discord was talking about, you know, alerts. You know, he heard about vendors doing certain alerts, and I remember it made me think of, remember Google alerting? Did you guys ever use that?
Yep, I got
You
it
know what I'm
turned
talking
on. Yes.
So yeah, but they changed the service. I don't know if it works the same, but I did go through a cool course with Route 9B way back in the day, and one of the things that they brought up, which I thought was a cool idea, was they would set up Google alerting for all the different types of paste bin sites, and they would put like the company domain in there, right? So there was ever a dump that was associated from anything that had people's emails or references to their usernames type of thing, you would get alerted and know that, hey, someone's creds might have been popped from this other place or something like that. And it was and you know, you can set up email alerts and you can figure out how to bring that in if you want to automate, kind of do some things with that. But it was also, I mean, those types of tools are really cool. But yeah,
yeah, I think Pastebin's API changed because we were using it early on to kind of do some intel gathering. And I know they changed some of how they allow access to kind of scrape Pastebin. So that could have been why there was that change in the alerting.
Well, that's what was cool about the Google alerts. You just give them the domain and they'd use their auto crawler to see those things versus like interacting with the site specifically.
Yep.
Like most people, but yeah, so
cool.
We
pivoted hard off the original topic, but I love it.
No, it was good. It was good. made me like reminisce about cool things that I've forgotten about. So, but yeah, I'll jump into the next topic. And this really, I kind of want to talk about kind of why threat hunting is such a powerful thing and something that always gets forgotten. So this really kind of is a call to the recent Microsoft exploit vulnerability, right? Where you get like a calendar invite, it's got specific fields that have UNC pass that force an SMB call out so that your NTLM hash is being shared, that it can be then, potentially brute forced, broken, rainbow table, whatever. And you can lose creds that way, right? And it was associated with Russia, and obviously Russia, they have proof that they were using this by all through 2022. I don't know if in early 2023. Obviously, the vulnerability still exists, so they could be. But when it comes to like really good threat intel and threat hunting, like if you look, first off, SMB leaving the organization, most security professionals know it's not a good idea, right? As long as you can determine what is your organization and what isn't. Usually it's the private IP address space. We had some funny stories earlier talking about how sometimes you don't control what IP space your network engineers want to use. That's neither here or there. But this whole idea of forcing someone to try to, share credentials or authenticate outside your network was discovered back in 1997.
Ooh.
Right, a long time ago. So this concept, and obviously there's a MITRE technique, so they had things about it. But 1997, so this idea of and it was really scary back then. I think they were using, taking advantage of Internet Explorer to do this types of things. Well,
Not Clippy?
1997 when I worked. What's that?
It was all Clippy.
Did not Clippy?
Oh, not Clippy. So I'll share that little nugget there, and where I was reading about that before I pivot to the next thing. So what's interesting about this is, in working for the energy company, right? We were obviously, oh man, I forgot the H on my copy. I'll try to edit that if I can. I was working for an energy company, and sure enough, Russia, interested in U.S. energy stuff, had a huge campaign, and they're really interested in trying to figure out how to get you to do the same type of technique. So they cared about SMB. They wanted you to basically interact and communicate with them, or wherever their servers were, the SMB. And the thing about that was they had three other novel ways to do that. And this was in like 2015, I think it went back to, and then they had some activity then in 2017, it really ramped up. So we're talking, almost 10-year span, still similar techniques. And then you get to, in the stuff in 2015 to 2017, they had spear phishing emails. And what they basically were doing were sharing a Word document that was looking to pull down a DOTM called .m template, which from an SMB server. So you can basically tell Word to say, hey, there's this template for this file, go fetch it. So the same activity was being generated, right? You pull this down, second you open the document, SMB communication out. But not only that, one of the other ways they also were trying to leverage this was they actually were using watering holes. They had compromised sites that people commonly go to, and they were putting basically a 1 pixel image file that when you load the site, it would then call out SMB because that's where it was saying it was stored. So they would do that as you hit the site. And we were actually seeing activity of this. And we actually worked with the FBI to help them, root out some additional sites, which is really cool. Give a shout out to Chris Collins, one of my other analysts who actually discovered a lot of this. So here's I was going to share the phishing email stuff, but I'm going to get to the text so I can actually share the text. So you can see that. But the call out from the site was, pretty novel and easy. I mean, you wouldn't think anything of it if you were looking at the site unless you knew this was a technique. But there's the spear phishing. The watering hole, like I said, it was like image source equals file : / and it had an IP address, and then try to pull that out. I'll show the sample of that in Discord, so you can see that as well. But then another thing that was interesting, so talk about obsession with SMB, right? Russia seems to really like this technique. So if you know how SMB is being utilized, I'm getting duplicated text warnings from our bot. That's okay.
I thought you were warned for
but
the input. That it's yelling at you.
Right. Fish.
So yeah, there's a sample of what was actually found on the site. You can see the image source file. So it's something to look for if you're actually curious. But they also used LNK files, shortcut links. So this was an interesting way to stay persistent. So when they would create an LNK file, you can actually, the icon for those LNK files, you can have something to load the icon from a file share. So what they did was they dropped in wherever this icon was for this LNK file. So every time you pulled up a directory with that LNK in it, so if it was sitting on your desktop, it worked all the time, it would just constantly call out. So you'd be sharing SMB or NTML hash constantly, and that was a persistent way to collect these things. So they did all three of these techniques to focus on the same type of technique this current exploit is doing. And this was like 2015 to 2017. So what I bring that up is, gosh, I think it makes so much sense to be profiling how SMB is being used in an environment. It's an example that, like, we can come up with a perfect way to say, ooh, we found an LNK and it's associated this SMB call out, or it's really weird, or we found this phishing thing. But you can see there's many different ways to cause that behavior, versus if you focus on just the behavior, you might find all these things kind of working backwards, but you know that something suspicious has already gone on. And so there's advantages to both, but I feel like that's kind of the point I'm trying to drive out here.
Can you give a couple examples of when SMB is like normal activity or normalized real quick, just to kind of talk through that and why this is kind of scary from a
so SMB should never leave your network. I'm sure there's some edge cases, so I can't ever really say never.
Mm-hmm.
But it's usually, if you're interacting with file shares, it's a perfect place for that. If you're interacting with your DC, it's also a perfect place for that. So those are the type of communication you see. You should be questioning when you see SMB between workstation to workstation, because a lot of times that's associated with lateral movement. So internally, you can profile that too, right? Like, where's SMB going? How often does it commonly go in between workstations? And something else to note is, 445 is the standard port for SMB, but you can get SMB traffic over kind of the legacy 139, the NetBIOS protocol stuff. But that's where you would expect to see it. Typically,
right? The 139 would be the unencrypted. The 445 would probably be the kind of the encrypted traffic protocol.
Yeah, where you use like version 2, version 3. I think there's multiple versions, and I do believe the encryptions and how those are protected are based on the versioning. It's been a while since I've actually looked at the protocols, but
and that connection
you shouldn't see SMB leave.
Yeah, and that connection out would typically have that LTLM hash.
NTLM.
NTLM hash associated with it, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I'm copying from all the wrong places when I'm trying to share this. So what's interesting, right, is if you think your threat is Russia, and you've seen over at least a decade where they continue to revisit this technique, this is something you should be hunting for and maybe have some detections around. And like I said, there's obviously multiple ways they found out how to cause this to occur. So detections aren't, I wouldn't say your one-stop shop, but maybe if you understand some of these techniques, you can build detections for those specifically, because honestly, knowing exactly what happened speeds up response, right? But if you can't build those into detections, or you're looking for potential future exploitations of this type of technique, that's where hunting comes into play, right? Where you can overlap hunting detections to say, yeah, if we know exactly what it is, perfect, we respond to it appropriately, we know how to handle it, versus now you see this behavior, you hunted for it, you've profiled your network, you know what it looks like, and now you can then say, ooh, this might be some new novel thing we don't know about, but you knew you were hit by it, so you might be the first to discover it. Or you might be able to then, if you know something's wrong with a box, maybe you think something's wrong, but you can afford to wait and watch further, you can learn about additional techniques they might try in your environment, which will then help you even kick them out further and keep them out longer, kind of thing. So I think those are all, really valuable to note, right? I keep trying to post in the Windows leash sharing versus my own. I'm like, why is this not working?
Yeah,
But that being, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to talk about, so that was, and brings up another good point. I think we have a blog, and one of our guys should probably share it, but when we're looking at this exploit, one of the things that was really interesting is we all kind of came to the same hypothesis as far as what you expect to see. And what was interesting was it didn't actually occur according to our hypothesis. And that's why I think validation when it comes to threat hunting is really important. If you can validate it, I mean, sometimes it's really hard and you might not have the skills and you just got to go with what you know. But validating this one specifically, we learned a lot of things that were different than how a majority of the security professionals were hypothesizing this would look from a data perspective. So yeah, you can check out our blog there, get some insights into that. But it was kind of it was a stressful time because when something doesn't work and you beat your head against the wall forever, and then it finally works and you can do something with it, that's rewarding, but it does take some energy away from you. But definitely check that out because it definitely pertains to what we're talking about as well.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
Lee,
thoughts from you guys.
Yeah, Lee, I just sent you an article from Microsoft around best practices for SMB. And so I did a quick look on kind of best practices for firewall and perimeter firewall approaches. It's interesting, they talked a lot about inbound SMB. And they said that it had been, at least Windows Firewall, it's blocked by default inbound since Windows XP. And then I started reading outbound, and I didn't see that being kind of natively blocked using the Windows Defender Firewall or just basic Windows Firewall. But of course, there's standard practices of operations, right? SOPs around firewalls and networks. I'm sure there's plenty of network engineers out there that would, hopefully have this kind of in place. But it's always good to kind of track some of these exploits and these capabilities. I mean, there might be a use case for you to have SMB out, but of course, you then probably want to have very specific inclusions on the IP addresses or domains or hosts or where that traffic is going. But Scott, to your point, I mean, this should be off of kind of the initial indication. This should be a very easy detection to put in place. Notify me, or let me see a graph or visualization of all outbound SMB traffic across my org.
Right.
And that's the first place to start, right?
So
go ahead.
I was going to say I liked I'm going to say his name again, or
Jay.
their name. I don't know who they are. Jay with underscore. His question was, I noticed a lot of malicious activity attributed to actors from a particular country. Is it easy to spoof where the traffic is from? And how do you know it's from the same actors coming from different places? It's a great question, and it's interesting because as you follow certain threat actors, some like to hide more than others. So I mentioned Russia, and I've just followed a lot of things about Russia based on where I've worked and them being a threat and so forth. And like, for instance, their profile is they either like to compromise third-party companies and come from them. So that kind of like the smaller people on the totem pole to attack the bigger people, or they just come from Russia, ironically. And I talked to a former CIA operative who his specialty was Russia, and he kind of said that they're, I wouldn't use the term wild, but they kind of don't care, right, if it gets associated back. So that's something that is a characteristic of personality that you can kind of attribute, versus there's some actors, like I feel like China usually tries to be a little more stealthy. Obviously North Korea has to be, because they only have an IP block of like so many IP addresses, so they have to come from somewhere else. So kind of understanding adversaries over a period of time, I think, helps. Not to say that they can't come from anywhere, right? Like I remember we used to do geo blocking as a control. It's not really, I would say, a control, because what you'll force them to come from somewhere else, if anything. But it does reduce a lot of noise potentially from specific botnets and the standard kind of automated approaches to offensive security. But yeah, no, it's a good thing to be thinking about as far as attribution. I usually don't care about attribution until it's blatantly obvious, and then it's like, oh, okay, this like everything I've seen is fingerprinted, and I can pick between 2 or 3 adversaries of who it is. So I start to use that for like maybe predictive defenses. Like, okay, have we seen these other things yet? So I can then pivot to say, well, I want to look for these other things, or anything net new that comes out with their tag, I'll look for those things too. I might not turn anything up, but it just helps me prioritize my time, I guess, more than anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess the kind of the personality of, let's call it a Russia campaign or an actor, right? To your point, they don't care. I mean, there's attribution, there's understanding where it's coming from, but you know, are there any you know, is there blowback from them doing that over there, right? There's not typically operations where we can go arrest those people in
Yeah.
Russia, or you know, there's no consequences to their actions. So who cares if you see an IP address coming from Russia? They have a way larger IP block. So block that IP, that's fine. I'm just going to move to another one and another one and another one, or VPN somewhere else, right? So there's really no risk in them kind of showing their cards outside of
Yeah,
being
you
able
bring
to.
a
Oh, good.
I was saying you bring up a good point when it comes to blowback. I feel like if there's loss of life or such a significant financial impact, like for instance, you know, the pipeline when that was ransomware and like how it affected the economy and also resources, the government wanted to step in and do something about that
Mhm.
because it was that big. But if people can just, oh, I got access to your network and I have all your data, what's the blowback? People are like, protect your network better. You know, that's typically what happens, right? So it's like,
And that's why,
so
I mean, that's why you're not seeing this happen against, I mean, you do see it against critical infrastructure like the pipeline, but those are
right.
probably individuals that if a bad actor had their way, if we're talking nation state, they would probably slap them on the wrist and be like, hey, stop bringing so much attention to us at this point. Like, go after the little guys. There's no blowback, right? There's hardly any blowback of these organizations ransoming or encrypting these
Well,
smaller businesses and financial institutions.
They got to feel
so
it.
it's interesting. I want to say, I don't know who it was, but they're trying to basically say, what is the state of cyber warfare? And like everybody's waiting for this cataclysmic event to say, ooh, cyber warfare started now. And it's like, oh, everyone's just attacking and shutting things down. And it's like, well, what's happened is we've become so desensitized. Like over the years, it's been this gradual increase to
Mm-hmm.
where like, oh, I get phished at home, or I get phished on personal email. You're like, oh, whatever. Even though it might be tied to someone who's really trying to like encrypt everything and steal things from me and do these really awful things or steal my identity, and I just slap it on like, oh, it's another one, right? We're so desensitized. So for anyone to really have a strong response, it would be really, really hard, right? But like cyber war is going on. I mean, it's a pretty active game that people probably don't realize. But like I said, we're all kind of desensitized to the impact to our personal lives for the most part.
Yeah.
Would you say the cause of that is all the cybersecurity awareness training we have to deal with? Bob and
Yeah, so
Alan.
get rid of that. No.
Make it hard, make it scary. VR, zombies, yeah.
But it's,
Yeah.
I mean, and y'all have been, we'll call it the front lines of protecting organizations. I haven't had to sit in the seat of an analyst or a responder or a hunter, but the effects are felt across the industry for sure, right? The burden is on the analysts and those teams that are trying to protect these organizations getting hit every single day, right?
Well,
So there is an impact.
Like 2 years
so
most for an
well,
analyst before they turn
Yeah.
over to somewhere else.
I was gonna say the thing that is probably a terrible way to look at it, but I, sitting as an analyst, was always more afraid of my management than I was the adversary, right? Like I didn't want to mess up and have something bad happen, not because I was worried what the adversary would do, but because I'd be like, oh man, they're gonna get me because I didn't do my job, which maybe isn't necessarily the right approach for what you're really trying to do, but that's the reality of it.
Yeah.
And Lee, I think you mentioned that the last podcast that we did, the live around, you were talking about being a manager and like feeling like you were kind of underwater on all the things you had to deal with. But in your experience, have you felt that burden, right? That carrying kind of the weight of the organization on your shoulders?
That was definitely Poley. He was my supervisor. I
Oh,
was
okay.
I was the guy causing that, the underwater feeling. I was making sure that, hey, is your plate clear? Yeah, no, there's some stuff. I was like, well, I got this for you.
Oh, my bad. I thought you had mentioned that you kind of stepped into a role that you were managing or
Oh,
You're
no,
like a
yeah.
lead, right?
you were
That was,
lead.
yeah, that was
See, that much trauma, you forgot.
try to block it out.
Exactly.
It's clearly working until now.
Sorry.
This was supposed to be therapy. But no, you're right. Yeah, like I do remember the pressure of not just like we're getting attacked, but like the whole, are we following proper processes and procedures? We have an audit coming up. Do we have the evidence that we need? Do we have all this stuff that we need ready to go to get like a check? Because one, you got the defender coming in. It's like, are we defending our network? Are we finding the stuff that we're looking for? Are we doing our jobs there? Okay, if we're keeping them out, what about the auditors? Like a big security audit, if we fail that, that's big consequences for the organization. And then if we don't do our job on that end, which one's more catastrophic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fail an audit or get a bunch of, leak or breaches or, ransomware or anything. But yeah, no, that was, thanks, Mike.
Sorry, but you can be doing literally everything right, right that you're supposed to be doing, and still get breached, right? Because you're going to have that one unknown, that thing that pops up, like this SMB
We call people
vulnerability.
you don't control.
Yeah, right. And then it's, why didn't you protect us against this? And it's kind of all pinpointed down to those SOC teams and those analysts, right? So, or the manager, right? But it's a hard problem to solve, right? It's like,
So
Yeah.
I think that you bring a good point. I think the approach, and this is really more for management, isn't focused on like why did things fail. It's how do we respond, and what were the lessons learned and how we'd apply those. Like those two things you can walk away with as a success every time. If you're always focusing on those failures, right, that some people do harp on, like, oh, we got breached or this happened, it's like those are going to happen and you should actually expect them to happen so that you're prepared to do those other two things really well. So,
and containment, because if something does happen, how did you contain it?
yeah, it's that response, right? What did you do?
Right. Because I mean, call it a forest fire, right? Like if you're at that fire watch tower and you're looking down and something happens, that forest fire happens, how quickly can you respond and react and contain that fire? Like a fire is gonna happen, but it's really that response and that containment, right, that matters over time. So yeah, anyway, I hats off to y'all, right? I was just an engineer. So I mean, part of the burden was on us, but it's really those guys, the analysts that, have to deal with it on a day-to-day.
Yeah. Well, you learn a lot.
Yeah. Trial by fire for sure, but it's good.
Yep. I think, and so typically now we'll go into some higher level topics.
Yeah.
I know I was first up on the list, but I'd like to actually throw it over to Lee, because I think this kind of ties into the discussion we've been having today. Lee, and then you, Scott, as well. And maybe we can talk about those two topics, because I think it kind of blends seamlessly into the conversation we've been having today.
Which one do you want to touch on first? It sounds like you want to touch on mistakes first.
Let's do that one. All right, that's a good kind of roll in, and then we can talk about how do you fix those mistakes, but then also work together to build a cohesive team, right? So I think those two topics, and then we have about 30 minutes left.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So something I think, in past podcasts we talked about imposter syndrome. So I felt like this was also fitting because we've worked in the field long enough and we're not perfect by any means, right? So like we want to, or at least I want to talk, and I want to see what mistakes you guys made. But what are some mistakes you have made, either in an incident response or investigations, or anything that was kind of, I would say, detrimental, but something that went awry? And what was kind of like your takeaway? What'd you learn? What'd you do? Like, what was the scenario? How'd you fail?
Lee, how'd you fail? We're just really diving in today, man.
Thanks, guys. This is-
You got your tissue box close by, right?
Right. It's a therapy session.
Yeah. How much time we got? No. So the idea, so I failed a lot, and fortunately, I did so. Because what is it? There's always those things out there, but I failed so much that I had to learn. I had to figure out where I messed up. I had to like retrospectively look at myself and say, well, what should I have done better? I'm pretty sure back in the day, finding false positives was like a big thing, right? You're like, oh yeah, I found, I have false positives. So then you see the same alert over and over, and like it was that alert fatigue, right? You're just like, oh,
Yeah,
brute force, the same person over and over, and you're just like, disregard that. And then come to find out, it's like, well, that was either a pen test or that was like actually someone trying to get like a legitimate brute force. And you're like, oh crap, like, and then like, well, whose ticket was this? And it's mine. Not doing the due diligence and letting that fatigue kick in. Knowing what I know now, how to like pivot through data, how to actually run an investigation from that this side of things is completely opened my eyes to looking back at like, man, like I was just, drinking from the fire hose. I would say versioning, not checking up the update or keeping software updated. If you were around last time, we talked about Sysmon and how I was using an outdated version and it took down some, or it like had a data leak and it just took down some computers. Like, and unfortunately that was a critical feature at the time. So we had some computers down. The only way to fix it was to actually go in and re-image them and just like stand back. A text had to go there. So, there's some mistakes that I've made that I learned from. And even here, when I'm investigating some research, like I think Alex let me know back when I first started, I was like, oh man, I can't find this registry. I can't find this registry. So I went in and just turned on auditing, like on this whole high. And Alex was like, dude, your VM is spiking. What's going on? What are you doing? I'm like, I'm not even at my computer. I was like, what are you talking about? Like, come to find out, I was like, okay, maybe I should have reverted, like not kept that chain. But it was just, that once again, it's that frustration of, man, I need to find this. I know what I'm looking for. Where is it? And now I know to be a little more selective about it.
Can I share a story of yours?
What?
You're sharing a story
Can I
about
share a
him.
story of yours?
Great.
It's one of my favorite, and because it's a great story, right? Do you mind?
Which one is it?
I won't tell you which one. It's one from CyberShield. Kingping. Yes. All right.
That's how I learned how memory works in cron jobs work. Yeah. By all means.
So this was great because I remember when I started my first cybersecurity position, and the first question was, do you know Linux? And I was like, I know of Linux. And they're like, well, good, because you're going to be using Linux for every tool we use. And I'm like, okay. So it was like a fire hose. How does Linux work? How can I do things from the command line and terminal and things like that? And I learned to love Linux after that whole process, even though like at first it was like hitting a wall. Well, we went to CyberShield, did the exercise, and we knew, and this is when I was acting as a defender, not so much as like working with the exercise as far as running it. And we knew that there's a potential based on the threat that they would try to take down the company's website. And so we kind of theorized in our younger days of, well, if the website goes down, we want to know about it. So one of the ways we can check without just staring at the website and constantly refreshing was Well, we're like, hey, can we just ping it? Like if it drops offline, we'll know that something's happened to it. So
and we were
Lee,
running some diffs. We were running some diffs on it. We would capture it.
yeah, we were doing some diffs too. But what was great about it
This is
was,
great.
so we like theorized. We're like, all right, Lee. I was like, you do the website. You just got to ping it and set up some sort of cron job to ping it. But ping on Windows, it kills itself after 4 or 5 pings, right? Ping on Linux, it's indefinite.
Does not.
So when he cron jobbed kicking out ping over these intervals, it just created a new ping process continuously. And we had a guy that was looking at network
Oh.
traffic, and what was it? It wasn't like NetMonkey. What was it? The tool. Either way, it visualized based on the volume of traffic. You get these balloons that would show up over endpoints, and he was just like, went over to the screen, he's like, "Oh my god, I think we're being attacked." And you saw his balloon just growing, right? It was just getting huge.
So
He's
it
like, I
looked like
can't
a
see anything
DDoS.
else.
Did.
Oh yeah.
Big.
And not only that, but because we're working in a virtualized environment, we started like saturating all of our network pipes and some of the memory resources on the entire environment. And we're like, oh my god, like we're getting shut down. And it was just because of an innocent mistake, like one little thing, like thinking about ping differently on different OSs, and coming up with an idea that may or may not work. And so we called him.
Go ahead.
So we nicknamed him King Ping. That was the and
That's
but the
great.
thing was like he's never gonna forget that, right? So like value learned, it was an exercise, nothing that wouldn't impact anything. But
Did
it's
you
like
end up
those type of
DDoSing the
honest
site?
mistakes.
Did the website go down?
Oh yeah, we couldn't get anything on our network.
Oh yeah.
Until we figured out.
It was a big ping in this virtual range, and like people were like, we can't do anything, and like the attackers came in, were like, what's going on?
It's already
Can't do
broken.
anything.
Like
They're
we
like,
can't
is
attack
anyone
anything.
running anything outside of the scope? Like they're looking around, we're like, and like he walked away, and like I was like, all right, I'll delete the cron job. Delete the cron job.
That's
New
great.
chain. Like
But
restart.
we were like manually trying to delete processes, and we couldn't get them all deleted fast enough. We're like, all right, just shut the box down, like reboot
Hey,
the box.
best offense is a good defense, man.
Right. Try to do
Best
that.
defense is a good offense, whatever. But yeah, that's great. King Ping. That's your new name. That's what I'm calling it.
Yeah, my favorite. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, we'll make some shirts for Black Hat, and you'll have it on your back. It'll be Cyborg in the front, King Ping on the back. Yeah, we'll get you a belt.
So I'll talk about one of my embarrassing times, Lee. So you want to feel the full brunt. So one thing I like to think about before I tell my specific story that comes front of mind is if I look back on any investigation that I've done throughout my time investigating things, my first investigations are all done wrong. Like I've learned so much over time. If I would have gone back and redone some of the things, I would have done them such a better job and done things differently, frankly, in a lot of ways. But the one thing that I remember distinctly, and it was funny because I just got hired as an analyst in a SOC, first time working in a SOC, and we saw this connectivity to a known indicator. So we were functioning on indicators, like a lot of people did back, was it 10 years ago, maybe a little less. And it was like, hey, we have communication to go into this domain or IP. I think it was a domain, and it's clearly bad based on everything I can tell about it. So we were like, them bad things must be talking to it. When I was Googling this domain, you know how Google auto-suggests things? Well, Google auto-suggested and changed the domain I was researching. So it went to the more popular domain. I didn't catch that. So I went through the entire process and blocked said bad domain. And we were still getting all sorts of alerts and things are going on. I'm like, I blocked it, and it got to the point where the director called me directly and was like, I thought we blocked this domain. And I'm like, yeah, I put it on the block and I see the ticket's closed. Everything should be good. He goes, well, I went to it. It said, I'm still up. I'm like, why did you go to it? And two, obviously what we blocked didn't work.
Wait, the director is like, let me go to the malicious domain. Wow.
Well, he was like, I'm going to validate because he didn't have the confidence because we were still getting alerts. He's like, there's no way. So he validated and he was like, no, it's clearly not blocked. And sure enough, it wasn't. And it was because the auto correction, because I was like, how did I miss this? Like I went through all my steps, and sure enough, when I typed it into Google, it gave me like did you want to search? And I clicked through that quickly, and it changed what I was looking for. And I never thought about that time, right? So I'll never make that same mistake again. But things like that happen, right?
How much blowback did you get?
Well, so that's what was great is I had great leadership at the time. That supported me in general because they knew me personally. I think that's always important as a leader to know your people personally. So they knew that I wasn't a lazy person. I wasn't trying to do the wrong thing. I wasn't trying to rush anything. I just made a mistake. And it was a honest conversation. I had to get with my director and my manager on the same call, and just like, hey, I know you didn't do this on purpose. We got to be more careful in the future. Kind of this like, let's have an honest talk. And totally, I appreciated their approach because I know I needed to hear when I make a mistake because it's good to hear it. But they didn't blow it out of proportion. It was like the first time I made a mistake, I think, as I started on that job. So it wasn't like, hey, you have this history of just screwing up all the time. But it also made me feel like, well, shoot, now I got a short rope. I got to be really good for the next so much time before I make another mistake. So that was something that it stood out to me as far as mistakes go. But yeah, I mean, like, I don't know. Go ahead. You got a mistake? I want to hear about it.
Yeah, mine's from a different kind of perspective. No, so what I was going to ask you is, again, our background's a little bit different. Y'all are prior military. Right. Mistakes happen. You have to learn from them very quickly, especially with, y'all's background and what y'all did. But there was grace. You got a little bit of grace to make those mistakes, to screw up maybe once, but not twice, important. But not 3 times. But
don't make the same mistake.
Exactly. Learn from that mistake. Yeah. If you make another one, learn from that mistake. But if
make sure it's different.
Yeah, make sure it's different. Always make a different mistake. But
right.
I think, having a higher level conversation about leadership, it's really important to let people have a little bit of leeway into making those mistakes. Lee, I have a question for you real quick. And your mistakes that you made, did it lead to a loss in revenue or dollars or downtime, or was it tied to a service or a product, or was there a higher level implication for what you did?
So the ping ruined that whole 8 hours of training that we did, but the sysmon,
roughly.
That's great. Sorry.
Poley, what I think you and Roger blocked a lot of that. I didn't hear a lot of the knowledge that came from.
No, so it was the thing was because it was a bug that only affected an old operating system we probably shouldn't have been using at the time. It was kind of like hey, this sucked. This doesn't really fall, and we defended Lee because it was like, if we're going to deploy things out, we should test them appropriately, right? And there was no true evidence that it was tested on that specific type of old operating system and so forth. So, as far as responsibility falling on Lee, now Lee was doing what he was supposed to be doing. I had this really good idea. I'm doing all this testing. I've tested it in waves to validate how we want to configure things, and now we're ready to deploy. I couldn't ask more from what Lee was doing from that approach. Then when things kind of went south, that happened. Luckily, I remember I was actually on I was covering a night shift. So I was one of the guys running around at every single computer, like help desk, and like, all right, let's shut this service down so we can bring this back up, that kind of thing. So I was able to be part of the solution, which I think helped, right? Yeah. When you're a security person that makes a mistake, if you can be part of the solution, it's always really good. Don't be like, oh, that sucks. Well, let me know when that's resolved. Like, you should be actively engaged, hopefully. But culturally, that affects things, right? If the mistake is big enough, that's where you start running into the, hey, security wants to do this new thing, and it's like, oh, well, expect a lot more ramp up time to then exercise next new thing. That's the only thing that I feel like the impact really happens. I don't think it ever really falls on the individual. I've made mistakes, and luckily, other than just a conversation, maybe there's harsh words if depending on who your leadership is, but it shouldn't really impact more than anything else. So
yeah, I was having a conversation with somebody last night, and we were talking about from my baseball background, right? So like I fail 7 times out of 10. I had a good year, right? Every 10 at bats, if I failed 7 times, I'm doing really good. But there was some grace in failing and learning from those, I guess not mistakes, but failures. But there are good mistakes and there's bad mistakes. There are mistakes that you make when you're being aggressive and going about your job. You might
Like trying.
overextend a little bit. The bad mistakes are if you're lazy and you're not, you're not going about the things that you should be going about, like you're not doing the things you should. Those are kind of the bad mistakes, right? And so again, having that grace and leeway for those good mistakes to allow you to learn from those is important in careers of analysts and engineers and leaders as well, right? You need to learn how to talk to the team and allow them to make those kind of aggressive good mistakes.
So I was gonna say I've got a story to tell as far as poor planning and mistakes that I've had to work through, and it was not so much security, but like IT specific, and it was a military-based thing. If you want to hear it,
Yeah.
but I remember when. All right, I'm jumping in. So I may have told you the story before. I don't know. I don't know who I tell the story, but this is a story I actually bring up a lot because it really grounded me as far as like, when you start getting that bigger head and you make decisions and you realize you're wrong, it's like really good to like get that. All right, I'm not as smart as good as I think I am. It's kind of a good place to be. In this case, I remember being overseas. I was responsible for networking, right? And the way our shop worked overseas was if we lose communications, you could potentially lose life, right? Because you're actively taking away resources that enable people to do their job. So there's a big cost involved. And I remember thinking, hey, I'm gonna get ahead of the game because in a router that we were using overseas, because everything's full of dust, dirt, and whatever, I could hear fans and things going bad. Like it audibly know there's something wrong. And I'm like, I'm gonna put in like, hey, we're gonna do a service on this. We're gonna take this offline. We have a new device we can put in place. Should be easy breezy. So I'm like, yeah, it should be like 15 minutes tops. I had this whole planned out and I had like these contingency plans, but I also had this like savvy thing that I thought was going to work. And in this specific router model, there are modules you put in, and there's 2 different types of modules. One had their own independent CPU and one didn't. Well, if you had the module without the independent CPU, it would rely on the config of the entire router. If you had the one that had its own CPU, then you had to figure out how to get into that to configure it separately when you first, and I didn't know any of this. So things went down, did the whole thing, and nothing was coming up. And the only type of resource I had was an antenna that went basically dial-up speeds to a satellite, so like double the speeds of dial-up, to try to make the right Google searches to figure out how to fix this problem when you only have a small window of time to fix this problem.
Sweating.
And I was so grateful. What's that?
Just sweating, like nervous.
Oh,
I'm sure as
well, I was sitting there thinking like, I was more worried now that it's like, well, if I put the old one back online, is it going to come up? Like, are we really isolated in the middle of nowhere with no way to talk to people, right? I had a great leader at the time who was just like fighting off all the upper leads, whatever you want to call them. And he'd always check in like, how are things going? I'm like, we're working. He's like, all right, I just need to be able to look like I'm coming back and forth so they think that I'm doing something. I'm like, perfect, just keep that up and I'll do the best I can. We got it back online. Yeah, but we got it back online, and it was very humbling to say, because I went into something with a plan, I thought I knew exactly how everything was going to work. I didn't really stress over I didn't really think through all the things that could go wrong. So I kind of set myself up a little bit. Some of the stuff I couldn't have predicted, but it was a pretty big mistake. And the one thing I did was I was in it, just didn't panic and just worked through it. I think that's what most people at least should be expected to do.
How would you categorize that as a mistake, though? Was that poor in the planning or the execution, or it was just something that like you didn't know what you didn't know in that situation about that?
So yeah, some of it was ignorance, right? But I feel like with how big the cybersecurity field is, you'll find yourself in that boat a lot, right? You don't know what you don't know, and all of a sudden you saddle yourself with, well, shoot, now I'm in something. People are gonna ask questions about this specific thing, and I'm thinking the same thing. Like, what the hell is that, right?
Yep.
So, and I feel like, but the thing is it's the best response I've ever learned. And Mike, I hope you don't take away from this like I don't know what I'm talking about when I give you this answer. But if someone asks me a question I don't know, my response is I don't know. It's I don't know, but I'll find out for you. I'll look into it, right? Basically saying like you can't expect me to know everything, but just because I don't know doesn't mean I don't care,
So the
right?
moral of the story is have a good connection to Google, right? Like, right.
ChatGPT now, right?
Yeah,
So, I
true.
mean, my career is hingent on my ability to look things up and translate that into what I need to do
Yeah.
and troubleshoot and uh, translate, right? So, again, all of us, I mean, no matter how many SANS classes you take, how many certifications, Security Plus, CSSP, you could take every single course available on SANS and you would still run into a situation that you don't know how to operate in.
Yeah.
And that's when you need to take all of that skill and knowledge and translate it, maybe look it up. Um, so to know every single internet protocol or, encryption methodology or, hypothesis for hunting is impossible, right? It's all about
So
the understanding
I
of those
will
fundamentals.
I will be honest, I've run into people that can recite those specifics incredibly well, but they lack the ability to think. And I would
Yep.
much rather have the ability to think than be able to recite things verbatim from just a lexicon of stuff.
ChatGPT.
Application stuff. Application
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
How to apply it. So I
Right.
guess, I mean, we have 10 minutes left. I didn't talk about any mistakes that I've made, so we can just cut off the podcast now. I'm just joking. So
We got
I've had a lot of product experience, right? So I worked at a managed service provider. I worked at a SOAR product, and then now starting Cyborg and building a product, right? So a lot of my experience on mistakes have direct implications to revenue and customers and uptime and SLAs, and that is terrifying,
I
right?
bet.
So I cut my teeth in cyber at that managed service provider. It was myself and two other individuals that managed basically the service, the engineering, the infrastructure, the SLAs on uptime on the VPNs, like literally everything associated with what we did. It was myself and two other people. And then luckily we hired a couple people later on, but we had 2 deployed products on customer sites. We had VPNs, we had the whole service, process. So every time I did something, it felt the stress of the company on my back, which sucks, right?
Yeah.
I remember on one of those products we deployed, I was running an update and I wiped the product. And I was like, I felt my heart drop to the floor, my gut wrenched. I'm like, oh crap. Like, what do I do? Right. And this is kind of customer data on what we were doing and no real way to back it up because it was on their environment and we weren't taking daily or weekly backups because the data was just too much to try to back up, right? Like network data. Um, and so in that moment, again, I had great leadership, my manager, the team around me. We figured out a way to at least get them back up and figured out a way to kind of communicate what was lost, what wasn't lost, and potentially how to recover moving forward, right? So I had in that mistake, I had direct impact because the contract could have turned for SLAs. It could have been a direct loss of revenue. And anytime you're in those situations, like outside of the security posture of so we also had to control the security posture of the org too, right? So like
Yeah.
everything that could go wrong was on our plates. And so having the ability to make that mistake and work through it was huge for me because I realized that like one, that changed my standard operating procedure. We built framework and process and policy around those things that we made mistakes on. So we learned from them and it never happened again. But being able to navigate those mistakes to make sure that we, control the fallout is really important. And that's where the management comes in. Scott, to your story about that leadership kind of having your back, right? Like taking that fire so you can go do the thing you need to do to recover is huge.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah. And so even now, at Cyborg, SLAs are important, the revenue, protecting the org, like it's still, mistakes can't happen, but if they do, you should have kind of that plan B, C, D of how to recover, how to move forward. So, yeah, that's my story. I won't go into specifics, but that's just the one.
I said I have been lucky that every mistake that I've made normally doesn't have anything to do with life loss or loss of life, limb, eyesight, or money.
Right. I did run a RM-F star on a computer once just to see what happened, but it was not a production server, so it was fun to see it blow up.
That's where you test, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Never test in a prod environment.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's my public announcement.
Always have a non-prod environment because some orgs only have prod, so
Yeah. Or some orgs dev environment mimics prod too much to the point where they're actually using those resources in prod and you can't test on, which is always an awkward circumstance to be in.
Man, yeah, I've heard horror stories about, especially like production database, large data that you can't replicate, so you just kind of like attach to it. Yeah, not good. Anyway, lessons learned across the board, right? I think
so
go.
I was gonna say we're kind of, if you guys got some closing comments, we're kind of coming up to the outro here so that we can close this one out. So if you guys have anything else, go ahead and say it, and then I'll kick off the outro.
I thoroughly enjoy these conversations. I think it's really interesting to talk about kind of everything else we deal with from a security standpoint, right? Because there's conversation about the technical side, there's conversation about how we do our day to day, but there's always these underlying things that people in our industry deal with that it's really cool to kind of talk about and explore. So again, always
I think we get down to the people part, right?
Right.
Like we get down to the people. We definitely cover some technical stuff, but there's some underlying people things that I don't think people talk about enough. Hopefully people listening find value there. I mean, it's great for me to like kind of unload on you guys as far as things I think about on a routine basis, and hopefully, and we should honestly. So a shout out to Jay. I'm gonna keep saying it that way because underscores. But we really should really acknowledge the people that chat the most with us on Discord. I really appreciate the comments and questions there as well. That's awesome. And don't be shy. Trust me. We just talk about our mistakes. We'll talk about our failures. There's nothing you can say that we're not going to be rude or mean about.
Right.
So
and Lee had a whole therapy session today, so it's great.
I do feel a lot better.
Yeah.
I hope my access works tomorrow. I'll say that. No,
not cut you off, man. Not cut you off.
If you could learn from our mistakes from here, I mean, more power to you. I mean, like, yeah, sometimes you need to learn from your own mistakes, but like Mike said, don't make the same mistake twice. And we gave you some very good examples.
Ping.
Yes. Sorry, Lee.
All
right, so before we go, I want to mention some good discussions that will be coming up. We have the threat hunting workshop with Lee, hunting for lateral movement. So you guessed it, another hands-on using tools and real data to hunt for different lateral movement techniques. You receive a lot of good, these workshops have gotten a lot of good feedback. They're kind of like CTF challenges. So definitely look for those, register and start setting up, and you can earn your level 1 badge for lateral movement. We also have a talk, hybrid hunting, threat hunting in a managed security battle space. So I'll be working with Justin Hurd from Newspire, talking about hybrid hunting and some unique advantages that come with that approach. And you hear some real world experiences and things. It should be a fun conversation. And then you'll get to hear from me again if you want for a top cover threat hunting management workshop from KPIs to metrics. We'll be talking about things to be thinking about when running, a threat hunting operation. As far as what you do, what you look at, how do you measure, things to think about. So join that. But with that, thanks everyone for joining. Once again, love talking shop with friends and colleagues. If you like what you hear, check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to your podcast, and leave a good review so others can, discover us as well and join the conversation. We really like the interactive parts of the conversation. So feel free, if you just your first time hearing and you're a little shy, next time jump right in, please. And then if you're outside the live podcast, we have our brief 30 to 45 minute. They kind of been going a little longer because we talk a lot, as you can tell, but we'll hit on 5 breaking news topics and really try to tie in technical things associated with, intelligence reports, technical write-ups from others, news topics that are breaking, and you'll see that about every Wednesday. So check those out as well. So with that, happy hunting.
Take care, guys. See you.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Out of the Woods podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss an episode. For more information or to connect with Cyborg Security, check us out online at www.cyborgsecurity.com and follow us on social media. We'll see you next time.